They said it would last forever, the eternal city. An empire whose armies crushed nations, whose roads stretched across continents, and whose emperors were practically gods. For centuries, the entire world seemed to bow to just one city, Rome.
But here's the mystery. How does a civilization that literally defined the known world just fade away? This isn't your typical story of one big battle. No, this is about how an empire can die not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost unnoticeable whisper.
You see, in the year 476 AD, there was no epic world-ending battle for the fate of Rome. The last emperor in the West, who was just a teenager, by the way, was simply deposed, pushed aside. The crown was packed up and sent east, and for most people, the world just kept turning. To really get how this could even happen, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. So how did this small city-state on the banks of a river in Italy grow into a global superpower that could have such a spectacular collapse? Well, Rome's rise was just relentless. After its mythical founding, it kicked out its kings in 509 BC and created a republic. For centuries, it was constantly at war, first with its neighbors in Italy, then came the Punic Wars, this epic, century-long struggle against its great rival, Carthage. Once Carthage was finally wiped off the map, the Mediterranean Sea basically became a Roman lake. And all of this expansion eventually broke the Republic, leading to the rise of the very first emperor, Augustus, in 27 BC. But here's a really interesting debate historians still have. Why did Rome expand so much? Was it all some grand plan for world domination? Well, the Romans themselves often claimed it wasn't. They promoted an idea we now call defensive imperialism. The basic theory is that Rome never actually wanted an empire. It was just constantly forced to react to threats, and it reluctantly took over territory just to keep itself safe. But was it really that simple? I mean, the other side of the argument is that Rome was, at its core, a deeply militaristic society, that it was driven by this powerful thirst for glory, for wealth, for land, for conquest. And in that version of the story, keeping ourselves safe was often just a really convenient excuse to start another war. The real truth, it's probably somewhere in the middle, a complicated mix of both. Now, all this relentless expansion, whatever the motive, led to something incredible, a golden age. But as we're about to see, even during its best years, the empire was already planting the seeds of its own destruction. With the first emperor, Augustus, came the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And for about 200 years, the entire Mediterranean world saw a kind of peace and stability that was just unheard of in human history. This was Rome at its absolute peak. Trade routes were safe, connecting Britain all the way to Egypt. Roman engineering was legendary. Their roads, their aqueducts, their cities were marvels. They built magnificent structures like the Colosseum and the Pantheon. A single system of law brought order to millions of people. But, and this is the crucial part, even then, the problems were starting. Those vast frontiers were incredibly expensive to defend. The whole political system depended on having a good emperor, and there was no guarantee you'd get one. And honestly, the empire was just becoming too big to manage effectively. Eventually, those hidden cracks widened into huge chasms, and the empire spiraled into a full-blown crisis. This wasn't just one problem, it was a whole bunch of problems converging at once, creating a perfect storm. By the 3rd century AD, that golden age was a very distant memory. The empire plunged into a chaotic, 50-year period we call the crisis of the 3rd century. And it was right here that all the systems that held Rome together just started to break down, all at the same time. Think of it like a domino effect. Politically, you had constant civil war. Dozens of emperors were murdered in just a few decades as generals fought for the throne. Economically, the money became worthless. To pay for all the wars, emperors kept adding cheap metals to silver coins until they were basically junk. This led to runaway inflation, and of course, taxes went through the roof to try and make up for it. And militarily, the army was stretched way too thin, trying to defend thousands of miles of border from increasing attacks. Every crisis just made the others worse. A historian writing at the time, Ammianus Marcellinus, he captured the feeling perfectly. He said the rulers, so paranoid about conspiracies, had become a terror to their own people. The rot inside the empire was becoming just as dangerous as any enemy outside of it.
Now, some strong emperors like Diocletian and Constantine, they tried to stop the bleeding. Diocletian decided the empire was just too big for one person to rule, so he split it in half, an Eastern empire and a Western one. Constantine later united it, but he also made two massive changes. First, he moved the capital away from Rome to a new city he named Constantinople, and second, he became the first Christian emperor, a move that would change the very soul of the empire.
But for the West, these desperate measures just weren't enough. And then, in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome itself, the Eternal City, was attacked and sacked by the Visigoths. It was a psychological blow that was just devastating. The idea that Rome was invincible was shattered forever.
And this brings us to the big twist in our whole story. Because when we talk about the fall of Rome, we're really only telling half of the story.
So the Western Empire, as we know, fell apart in 476 AD. It splintered into different kingdoms and entered a period that some people call the Dark Ages. But the Eastern Roman Empire, the one that we now call the Byzantine Empire, it not only survived, it thrived for another 1,000 years. It became this vibrant center of civilization, and it's the reason so much knowledge from ancient Greece and Rome wasn't lost forever. So why the huge difference? Well, a massive part of the answer comes down to one thing: geography. The West had these incredibly long, exposed land borders along the Rhine and Danube rivers that were just a nightmare to defend. But the East had shorter frontiers and a capital city, Constantinople, that was basically a fortress. It had water on 3 sides and some of the most massive, impenetrable walls ever built on the fourth. So after all of that, we are left with one of the most famous and enduring questions in all of history. The fall of Rome wasn't an event. It was a process. It was a long, slow, grinding breakdown caused by a toxic mix of political corruption, economic failure, military exhaustion, and huge external pressures. It was a systematic collapse, a civilization that basically bled out over generations. And yet, in a way, Rome never truly disappeared. Its legacy, its ghost, is all around us today. It's in the languages we speak, in our legal systems, in our architecture, and in our very ideas about what a government or a republic should be. Which leaves us with this final, massive question to think about. Was Rome destroyed by its enemies beating down the gates, or was the fatal damage already done by the cracks that were forming from within? It's a question that echoes through the ages, a timeless warning about power, ambition, and just how fragile even the mightiest civilizations can be.